Can we look forward from Joel Embiid?
I just want to win a championship. Whatever it takes. I don't know where that's going to be, whether it's in Philly or, anywhere else. I just want to have a chance.
The Sixers have had a tumultuous few years. Pretty much ever since Jimmy Butler signed with the Heat, it has been pretty much chaos. The Ben Simmons situation finally ended in James Harden being a Sixer, and him paired with Embiid was admittingly an interesting and potentially deadly duo, but now here we are, and James Harden himself is a situation. Both times they have been in the NBA playoffs, they have disappointed rather significantly as a duo. Now James Harden has asked out, and he will probably be gone before the season begins, and looking at where his value is right now, I feel the odds the Sixers get anything great in return is pretty minimal, and as a result, looking at their roster as a whole, the future of this team is not pretty. Before I get into today's video, I want to talk about our sponsor, Factor. If you're like me, aka a 20-something single dude who doesn't have the slightest clue how to take care of yourself, you probably have a pretty erratic diet. This makes eating on a consistent schedule and eating healthy extremely difficult. I have been trying to be much more deliberate with my diet, and Factor has been a huge help in that. Factor makes your nutrition goals easy by delivering fresh, never frozen meals right to your door. I know the health benefits are what might stand out to you initially, but eating on a consistent schedule is a huge help for your body as well. And if you have a hectic schedule, being able to prepare something quickly like you can with Factor really helps. Only 2 minutes in the microwave and your meal is ready. Another thing that's great with Factor is it's very customizable, specifically to different approaches to your diet. There are vegan options, calorie smart options if you're trying to lose weight, keto options if you're avoiding carbs like the plague. And for me, I went with the protein plus option because I'm trying to put on some muscle, and also I'm just a carnivore. The last few months, my fitness and dietary goals were kind of at odds with my work goals. I found it hard to find the time to prepare my meals, and I default to fast options that were not necessarily the healthiest. But because of Factor, when I don't have the time to prepare something, I can get the speed paired with the nutrition as well as a great taste. Head to factor75.com or use the link in the description and use code RustyBuckets50 to get 50% off of your first Factor box. Again, that is code RustyBuckets50 to get 50% off of your first box. Shout out to Factor for sponsoring this video. Over the last few years, the Sixers have managed to disappoint in the playoffs pretty much every time. Now, to be fair, I wouldn't say 2019 was their fault, and 2020 doesn't really count for much because Ben Simmons wasn't playing for them, and that used to be a negative thing. But 2021, the disaster in Atlanta, losing a series they had no business losing. 2022 was a weird year, but still, I'd say the Harden and Embiid duo underwhelmed in their first playoffs together. But this year was supposed to be the real deal. No more Ben Simmons BS in the playoffs to blame, and no, they just traded for Harden to blame. They had a full season together, and they looked particularly dominant on the offensive end as a duo, and Embiid looked very good defensively, and obviously this all culminated in him winning an MVP that his entire fan base bitched and moaned about until he got it, so congrats, you did get that. As a result of this regular season success, the Sixers went into the playoffs feeling like they could beat anybody. And thanks to a few sporadic games from James Harden versus the Celtics, they actually did have a very legit shot of winning that series when most picked the Celtics going into this. Beating the Celtics would be something big for them given that they've found that impossible in the past, and would also mean they would advance to the conference finals, the first time that would happen for Joel Embiid's entire career. However, they decided they were going to choke it away in a Game 7 where Harden and Embiid combined for 24 points on 8 for 29 shooting. Now James Harden wants out, probably will be out, and with how sporadic he has been over the last few years, both as a personality and a player, I can't imagine the Sixers are going to get good value in return for him, especially not on a one-year deal. After he is moved by the Sixers, that will mean the last two teams he was on, he asked specifically to be on, was traded there, and then asked to leave in under 2 seasons. So as a result, he's not willing to commit to any team, it seems, unless it just goes his way immediately. So teams really aren't going to be willing to commit to him. And as a player, of course, he did have those random 40 pieces in the playoffs, and that's cool, but his overall performance was bad, and he decided to yet again put up an historic stinker as a star in a Game 7. It seems like the Clippers is probably where James Harden is going to end up, and that means the trade package would probably be something along the lines of Norman Powell and Robert Covington and probably maybe 2 first-round picks. And yeah, that trade package is rough, man. So ultimately the roster's not getting bolstered significantly by trading James. You could maybe make the argument, trade James for 3 role players, but if those guys are really not that great, Norman Powell's the best guy you're getting in return for James, ultimately you're coming out a worse team on the other end. I say that as someone who likes Norman Powell. Making a move like that does also immediately put a ton of pressure on Tyrese Maxey. Now, I'm a big Tyrese Maxey guy. I think he's very good and very underrated. He's probably he's my favorite player on the 76ers by probably a significant margin. I really, really like Tyrese Maxey, but I also wouldn't necessarily say the best creating option on a championship team. That's how I'll put it. The best perimeter player, the best playmaker, the best ball handler, the best shot creator. I don't know if he should be the #1 guy in that department for his team, even with Joel Embiid, who's going to do obviously a lot of mid-post shot creation. I really think Tyrese is probably best as your secondary on-ball creator because he has a very good off-ball game and his creation with the ball in his hands is in service of that off-ball game. And I think if you're constantly just divulging him to, dribbling the air out of the ball, I don't know that he's built for that for real. I think Tyrese can be a multiple-time All-Star, and I think he would be good in that role. But ultimately, if the goal is a championship-level team, I'm not seeing that. Now, even if Maxey does that well, going from James and Maxey to Maxey and Norman Powell, that is obviously a big downgrade. They also lost Jalen McDaniels and Georges Niang, 2 big wings, which are a commodity in the NBA. They're banking on someone born in 1985 to still be a huge contributor as a defender. And for the guys that are not old as dirt on this team, they just are not very good. Do we think that outside of Joel Embiid, Maxey, Norman Powell, and Tobias Harris as your 3 most prolific offensive options, but not only that, really the only offensive options you have, again outside of Embiid, because no one else on that roster is comfortably averaging over 10 points per game? That's just not enough, man. It's not enough to be a really scary offense. There's enough creation there that combined with Embiid, I'm sure they will be a serviceable one to maybe even a top 10 one just because Embiid is that good, but ultimately not an excellent one. And, maybe if you were even looking at this as they're sacrificing a little bit of defense for this offense, well, first, as I said, the offense isn't that great, but this defense is also not good. There isn't really a good defender on this roster besides for Embiid, Melton, and maybe the corpse of PJ Tucker, and maybe Robert Covington. If that is the trade you get for Harden. Don't get me wrong, it's not like Maxey or Harris are some big liabilities really, but they're not strong perimeter defenders to say the least, and Embiid is not in that class of defender where he's so good he doesn't need any help on defense, at least in the regular season. I don't know if any player is ever truly that good on defense, but I'm talking about Rudy Gobert basically being the only guy who can play defense on the Utah Jazz and them being a top 3 defense year after year because of that. That type of thing is probably not happening with Joel Embiid, and as good of a defender as he is, I think he could make them an average defense. But even last year, the Sixers were a below-average playoff defense, and that was with more defensive help. Also, please don't try and pitch me on Robert Covington being the savior. I wouldn't say he's necessarily cooked, but he's not the difference maker he was. We'll say that much. So looking at what this team will probably be going into next year, we're talking about a okay offense. We'll say maybe top 10, but like real close to 10. And like a passable enough defense that's like 18th. Maybe we'll say 15th if Embiid's that impactful. That's a depressing team, man. That's like a first round exit more likely than not, and at best a second round exit, which of course the Sixers know all too well. I do think that the coaching change from Doc Rivers could potentially make a noteworthy difference, but at a certain point you have to have good enough personnel, and I think this is a 25-win team at best without Joel Embiid, and it's not like Embiid himself is just the top shelf option to have as your franchise player. He can carry fine enough, but like, do you want him to carry you to 50 regular season wins and then flame out in the playoffs? Is that really just a thing you want to do every year? Here's what I predict. Either by mid-season this year or by the off-season next year, Embiid is going to ask for a trade. I would probably guess between the two it happens in the off-season. I imagine it would happen after a so-so regular season despite monster numbers from Embiid, followed by them getting embarrassed in the playoffs. Unless they just got an absolute layup of a matchup like, let's say, the Brooklyn Nets like they had this year, they would probably win that one. But against a even pretty good playoff team, I would be betting against the Sixers. And after that, and staring at a team that just is not very good, I think it's a make or break off season for the Sixers where Embiid's probably like, I'm good. You know, here's what you can do if you want to try and salvage this situation if you're the Sixers. Here's what I would do if I was Daryl Morey. If you're watching, he follows me on Twitter, but I don't think he watches. First of all, get as much as you can out of Harden, and hopefully it's something really good, because I think you might be screwed regardless if it's not. And then from there, you are going to have to make the tough decision of, do we trade a bunch of draft capital? Do we trade a bunch of draft capital in the hopes that it results in a player good enough that Embiid and that player or players can win a championship? Or do we realize that this just ain't going to happen and we should probably just hold on to our future picks and not screw over our future? It's a difficult balancing act to strike. It reminds me of what the Cavs were doing in LeBron's first stint towards the end, where they didn't want to trade draft capital, and apparently what's his freaking name, the power forward, I can't even remember his name right now, wouldn't trade for Amari Stoudemire just because they were like, well, LeBron could leave. I think it's the same thing. Like, what does Joel's future look like? As you saw in the opening clip, he doesn't necessarily seem as committed as he was. So yeah, man, I don't know. I don't feel great about the Sixers' future. I think it's pretty bleak, and I think the process is basically on its way towards being officially a failure. It is limping its way to the barn right now. Or out of the barn? What is that expression even? I don't know. Anyways, shout out to Rudy for editing this video, shout out to Factor for sponsoring this video, and goodbye.